we're going to dive into some, and then we will dive into some discussion questions. If you have any questions for our panelists that you would like them to address, you can put those in the chat and we will look at all of our questions at the end. So thank you so much once again for being here, and I'm going to pass it off to Alyssa to get us started.
There we go. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Frystack, and as Mary said, I'm the Director of Research and Data Analytics at PlaceEconomics. PlaceEconomics is a private research firm with extensive experience in the analysis of the economic impacts of historic preservation. So in my role, I'm responsible for data acquisition and preparation, methodology development, and also analysis. So I mainly work with census data, municipal data, as well as various other data sources. And I also rely heavily on GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, in my work. And what GIS helps us do is provide spatial context to the data that we're looking at, oftentimes in Excel spreadsheet form. Next slide. So PlaceEconomics is often hired by city or state historic preservation offices, as well as nonprofits, to conduct studies that measure the demographic, economic, and cultural impacts of historic preservation. Some of the questions that our clients are interested in answering include, what are the general demographic patterns in their historic districts? They're looking to see what kind of ripple effect that historic tax credit projects have had in their community. They want to know the job creation from rehabilitation activity. Some, especially recently, want to know how older housing is meeting affordable housing needs. Next slide. So through the research that PlaceEconomics has done, we've developed a number of methodologies that we find useful in dispelling some of the myths that historic preservation encounters, especially as it pertains to affordable housing. So after conducting numerous studies all over the country, we've really come to the conclusion that preservation alone isn't what's causing the affordable housing crisis. But rather, older buildings, whether they are designated or not, are playing a crucial role in meeting affordable housing needs. And on top of that, in a recent survey we conducted of preservation professionals, we found that 62% felt that preservationists should not just be addressing issues of affordability, but they should also be leading that effort. So this is definitely an issue that interests preservationists. That's why you're all here today. And it's also one that we see ourselves having a part to play in the solution. So before I get started, I'm going to mention a number of our PlaceEconomics studies while I'm speaking. All of our reports are available for free on our website, placeeconomics.com, under the Publications tab. So you're more than welcome to read them, download them, highlight, give them to your city council members, whatever you want to do. Next slide. So getting back to those myths about historic preservation and affordable housing, one thing that we hear is that historic preservation, especially historic districts, prevent the creation of affordable housing. You have all seen those articles the last couple of years in the New York Times and in Forbes and the Atlantic. Some of those articles go as far as saying historic districts directly cause homelessness. However, when you look at the total land area in cities that are actually under the purview of historic regulation, that criticism kind of seems ridiculous. What we've found is that in most cases, historic districts make up less than 10% of any given city's overall land area. And oftentimes it's actually much less than that. So in Los Angeles and Nashville, historic districts make up only 6% of the city's land area. In New York City, it's only 4%. And in Phoenix and Chicago, it's only 1%. So it's more nuanced than just historic districts prevent affordable housing. What really determines housing affordability is much more a function of zoning, the market, policy, public sector priorities, and things like that, rather than just 3 or 5% of a city's land area. Next slide. So on top of that, in our analysis, we've also found that housing is more affordable in areas with a concentration of older non-designated housing, or in historic districts that designate more vernacular housing typologies. So that was definitely the case in Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Phoenix, which are all cities that we've done studies in. Importantly, historic districts take up a very small share of a city's land area. They often already contain affordable housing, especially in areas that are composed of more vernacular housing typologies. And finally, high housing costs are more a function of many different variables rather than just one single culprit, such as affordable or historic preservation regulations. Next slide. So another myth that we encounter a lot is people saying that in order to make our cities more affordable, we have to add more density. However, in city after city, we found that historic districts are actually some of the densest areas in the city. We often find that they have a population density 2 to 5 times that of non-designated residential areas. This is due to a number of reasons, including smaller lot and building sizes, the presence of accessory dwelling units, including coach houses and granny flats, as well as legacy zoning practices that allowed for small scale multifamily structures. So historic preservation comprises such a small share of a city's land area, and they're already providing gentle density. So I think it's safe to say that historic districts are already doing their fair share and their part to provide density within our communities. Next slide. So one other myth that we encounter a lot when it comes to affordable housing is that, people saying old buildings are too expensive to maintain and or fix, and therefore they have to be torn down. So we were able to dig deep into this myth in the city of San Antonio because their assessment records contained really detailed information on building condition. And what we found was that, not surprisingly, a larger share of housing that was built prior to 1960 was in average or fair condition, as opposed to housing that was built after 1960. However, according to the assessor's office, average condition simply means that defects can be quickly and cheaply resolved, while fair condition means that minor repairs are needed to bring the building up to standards. So this kind of showed that, at least in San Antonio, the number of older housing units that truly warranted demolition due to astronomical rehabilitation costs was probably a lot smaller than what most developers would care to admit. Further, we found that nationally, the average cost to build a new low-income housing tax credit unit was $47,000 more than the cost to acquire and rehab a low-income housing tax credit unit. So this kind of confirms that it's more cost-effective to preserve existing affordable housing than it is to build new. Next slide. So in that same vein, at PlaceEconomics, we have 2 mantras that we use quite often. The first is that you can't build new and rent or sell cheap, at least without deep subsidies. And then the second is that every unit of older housing lost is a unit of potentially affordable housing lost. Next slide. So I want to bring in one final analysis that provides kind of a real world example to confirm those 2 mantras that we have. So in Chicago, which is where I live, we see a lot of small scale multifamily residential teardowns that are either replaced with new luxury condos or single family homes. So I found a couple of buildings that are literally right down the street from me in my neighborhood, and I wanted to use them to test those two theories that we have. So the first building on the left there was a 1909 3-flat apartment building. The one in the middle is a mid-century 5-flat apartment building. And the third was a 3-unit condo building that was built in 2018. So these buildings all sit right next to each other. And although they're on a street with a lot of extant housing and very little infill, this street is not part of any historic district. And what we found was that when we looked at assessment data and rental data, We found that on a square foot basis, apart from having an assessed value 3 times greater than the 1909 building, units in the new building also rent for twice as much as those in the 1909 building. So doing a little bit more digging, we also found that the 2018 building replaced an early 20th century cottage style 3-flat that was, undoubtedly providing naturally occurring affordable housing. So even though this is a really small microanalysis, its findings can kind of be extrapolated. And when situations like this happen again and again all over a city, it's easy to understand how it can begin a chain reaction that plays out in property values. So we've found that it's as simple as this. As long as the market in an area is strong enough, when an older housing unit gets torn down, that lot is rarely ever affordable again. And that has long implications on the affordability of the neighborhood. Next slide. So those are just a few of our findings. And I hope that they kind of help change and switch up and reshape the narrative around preservation and affordable housing. Yeah, thanks for having me. And I look forward to our discussion and our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Now we're going to hear from Isabel about more of the on the ground work. Alyssa gives us this great big picture, and Isabel is going to tell us about how that plays out in her business or her nonprofit, Restoration Housing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Thornton, and I'm the Executive Director of Restoration Housing. And we are a local nonprofit based in Roanoke, Virginia. Local meaning that all the work that we do is within our community. And we are very different from most other affordable housing developers that typically are working wherever there is a deal to be had, and that could be all over the state of Virginia. But where we are looking just to work in Roanoke or the surrounding region. But a big part of what we do is our mission is focused on being community based. So you can go to the next slide. Our mission, it is a dual mission for both preservation and affordable housing, to develop affordable rental properties for the benefit of limited income families and individuals through the rehabilitation and preservation of historic architectural resources, which I know is quite a mouthful, but fully encompasses our dual mission. We basically seek out blighted and vacant properties in Roanoke's historic neighborhoods, and we use all the tools in our toolkit for preservation, which is everything from historic tax credits to fundraising and grants, sponsorships from local corporations, you name it, to help cover these quite massive expenses to restore these blighted and vacant properties. Once complete, each project takes somewhere under a year to rehab. We rent them out as affordable units. 5 of our 6 properties are housing, and 1 is an affordable commercial property with co-working space for nonprofits. So we own and manage the properties as a landlord indefinitely. And we do that so that we can remain good stewards of the property, ensuring that it remains affordable and that it's well taken care of. One of the things we've noticed in our work throughout Roanoke, and Roanoke mirrors many other cities with older historic districts, is there is quite a bit of affordability in our city of units within these neighborhoods, but many of them are in a severe state of disrepair, even the inhabited units. Like I said, there's a lot of vacancy as well, which is what we're usually targeting, but we're seeing a lot of units that are affordable in the $500 to $700 range for families, but conditions that are not acceptable. And so we're really trying to offer affordable but high quality alternatives to affordable housing as well, where there's maybe not a really strong rental market in Roanoke that compares to these bigger cities like DC or San Francisco. But what we do have a problem with is the conditions. And And so we just want to reinvest, which is a big part of our mission, in neighborhoods that have been systematically devalued, but preserve the affordability of what are already affordable neighborhoods with a high quality alternative. New slide, please. So this is a project we completed in 2020. It's a house that is in a new historic district in Roanoke. It's called Southeast Roanoke in the Belmont Historic District. This house had been vacant for just a couple years when we began the rehab, but it had been mismanaged for decades and was in a pretty bad state. We were gifted the house and we cobbled together funding through a variety of resources. We used historic tax credits, as we do on all of our projects, which accounted for, as you can see in our pie chart, $173,000 of the rehab. We got a large grant from the State Housing Trust Fund of Virginia. Luckily, Virginia has incredible resources for affordable housing nonprofits that aid us tremendously in our construction costs. So without those resources, they can come anywhere from the State Housing Trust Fund. We also get funding through the federal government, through community development block grants. Virginia Housing used to be VHDA. A lot of those sources are specifically for affordable housing nonprofit developers. And it's a really key component to doing what we do. And we can get into this more in the Q&A, but I think a big part of aiding these astronomical preservation costs, which are largely quite high because the properties have been in such a state of disrepair for so long, come from the fact that we are seeking affordable housing, and there are a lot of affordable housing grants available out there. So it really is, it's our mission to do this, but I think it's an essential component to our construction financing that we are doing affordable housing, because there really aren't the sources out there if we were just focusing on the preservation alone. So yes, we got $300,000. This is 4 units, and it is permanent supportive housing, which means that it's a form of housing for people coming out of homelessness. And it is largely through a partnership with another local nonprofit in Roanoke called Arch Services. They serve as the social services side of the project and provide social services to each of the tenants. They actually hold the lease with us and they pay the rent. They do everything from financial counseling to mental health counseling. And it's a really key form of I think, best practices in the housing community for aiding people coming out of homelessness to offer what is not a transitional space, but a full-time permanent home. And we really couldn't do that without this funding. So we completed this project in 2020. It used to be the mayor of Roanoke from, I think he was turn of the century mayor. It was built in the 1890s, and it has all of this fantastic history related to Roanoke. It would have been one of Roanoke's nicest homes up on a hill right outside of downtown. And when it was built by him, it was quite large as well for the neighborhood. And ultimately, it slowly became less valuable over decades. It was in a neighborhood that was redlined. It was also cut off by the Interstate 581 system. So it's on a dead-end street that dead ends into the interstate. And it's across from our local rescue mission and homeless shelter. So over the years, it's lost a tremendous amount of its property value. And as you can imagine, then was bought at a distressed price by the landlord that owned it for several decades and did not reinvest any money back into it. So this is another example of what I said earlier, where you would see affordable rents, but really bad conditions. The rents in this property was 4 units before we took ownership of it, and they were in the $500 range, but they were tremendously terrible living conditions. And so we're really trying to offer a high quality alternative and reinvesting substantial dollars back into this neighborhood that suffered from disinvestment for decades. So next slide, please. These are some more pictures of the before and after. This is an ADA unit on the ground floor, as you can see, with the roll-in shower. We added a ramp so that the ground floor unit is ADA accessible, which is also really critical, I think, in both permanent supportive housing and affordable housing to offer an ADA option. Next slide, please. This is another before and after of one of my favorite projects. This is the community nonprofit space that we were talking about before. This home is one of Roanoke's earliest homes. It was built in the 18 teens on a 3,000 acre tract of land at the time by one of the sons of an early landholder in the area. And it's called Villa Heights. It's in the Villa Heights neighborhood of Northwest Roanoke. It went through several different families of ownership and iterations of design, and ultimately was owned by the city of Roanoke in the 1950s and 60s as a rec center, an after-school rec center for the neighborhood. And when the city had a budget shortfall in 2007, so I don't know if you can see well, but in these pictures, if you look in the left-hand corner of the property, you can see that there's a little cinder block addition on the left. That's a rec center that was added by the city. But the city had a budget shortfall and vacated the property, remained owners, but it sat vacant for 10 years. It had a fire, I guess, 3 years into vacancy that left a giant hole in the roof, the rear of the building. So you can see the damage pictures on the bottom there on the left that are from the fire. And there was subsequent water damage, heavy water damage, because the hole was just left exposed for many years. So our organization spent $1 to purchase this property. Which, you know, seeing the outcome of it now, you know, it does seem like a really affordable payment. But if you knew just the condition buying it, we were in an agreement with the city to get that price solely because we were planning to reinvest so much money into the restoration. It was just under $900,000 of costs, including construction and soft costs, you know, legal and accounting and architecture fees. And it is now a co-working space for nonprofits. We have one lead nonprofit tenant with 3 subtenants that sublease underneath them. It's also used for the neighborhood quite often for after school events, for weddings. It's a venue space. It's got 3.5 acres of land around it, a basketball court and playground, and it's really an excellent community resource. And it's in a neighborhood that has been underserved for quite a while. And I think that is a big part of the reason why it sat vacant for so long, because it needed so much work, and it was in a neighborhood that has not seen a lot of investment. And so we were reinvesting in a neighborhood that we believe could benefit heavily from this. And the nonprofits that are there now also are very deeply committed to the neighborhood and to doing their work in the neighborhood. And 2 of the leaders there also live in the neighborhood. So it's very much, I think, an excellent resource for the community. And we keep the rent incredibly low for this property as well. Next slide. Here are a few more pictures of the before and after. The bottom left corner is the room right below the room with the hole in it. So you can see the water damage is the worst in this room for that reason. A lot more of the plaster and the mantle had disintegrated and fallen through, and the floor systems had rotted through. The top left picture shows more of the heat damage from the fire. And as you can see the after pictures there, we restored all the original floors, the hardwood floors, original windows throughout, original doors, mantles, except in that one room where we had to rebuild the mantle. Original floor plan, all exterior details are restored in kind or original. And the only thing we really changed was a slight modification to a porch in the rear from a 2-story porch to a 1-story porch, out of just an interest in making it more structurally stable. So this 200-year-old house, I think, has some of the best bones I've seen of any structure we've worked on. It has actual tree trunk log beams in the basement. It's incredible to see these 200-year-old trees. I mean, they're not even remotely sanded down or anything. I mean, they're just tree logs. It's really cool to see how, the level of construction from 200 years ago sustained longer than a lot of construction that you might see post World War II. I mean, many of you in the preservation world are probably not surprised by that, but it's still really cool to see. So new slide, please. This is a project we just completed. It's in the same neighborhood that I mentioned before in Southeast Roanoke. It was a new district that was created in 2018 as a national district. To go back to what Alyssa was saying before about districts not being prohibitive to affordability, just to, I think, continue in that vein, I completely agree. National districts are a great tool for us to secure historic tax credits. As you can see, we received $135,000 of our construction costs from tax credits for this project. And we did that because it's a contributor to our national district. So the national district is a key piece to us doing what we do. Where there are probably more concerns about districts inhibiting affordability, I think it's more to do with local districts. And in this case, we are in a national historic district in Roanoke that is not a local historic district for the city. So the local districts are called our H2 districts. They typically have review by our architectural review board. And in that review can sometimes require compliance for things that any work someone might do would have to be in compliance and therefore would therefore cost more money. So for example, we have a project in an ARB district with a metal roof that's a hand rolled metal roof, that the cost to restore it is over twice what it would be if we just replaced it with a standing seam metal roof. But because it's in an ARB, it requires a hand rolled metal replacement. And in national districts, you don't have to comply with anybody. It's just an incentive and it's just a carrot. If you want the tax credits, you can use them and apply for them. And if you apply for them, you then have to comply. But you're not required to do anything differently to your home if you're not in an ARB district in Roanoke, a local district, which we're in this case. It's just a national district. So it's a great tool, I think, for us. And like I said, we get all these other resources from the state and federal government that are really critical. Community development block grant funding was a big piece of our funding model for this project, and a large grant from Virginia Housing. They have a grant available for, quote, stabilization and demolition. So if you can't stabilize it, the funding can go towards bulldozing it. But we were luckily able to stabilize this project. It had a giant hole in the roof. Actually, scratch that, sorry, a giant hole inside the house, a little hole in the roof. So that's the problem with a little hole exposed for too long leads to a giant hole that destroyed the rear floor systems of both the second and first floors, as you can see in these pictures. So you couldn't even get into the house to get a good look at it. So we applied for this grant to stabilize it. And our contractor helped us basically pull the house up and stabilize the ground floor and put in new structural support in the basement, and then reinforce any existing beams in the basement and reconstruct the floor systems. And then once it was stabilized, we began the second phase, which was the rehab phase, in March of 2021, and we completed this in November of 2021. It's a single family rental, and it is 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. And we've got a little video, I think it might be the next slide, to show you guys the before and after. It's now leased to a family of 7, a refugee family, and it has all the trappings of a single family home, except that it's affordable rental housing. So it has a private backyard and parking available. and all the amenities of a single family home in a neighborhood of mostly single family, but it's affordable rental, and what we think is that there's a strong need for in the neighborhood for affordable rental. So I think hopefully the video will play. If you don't mind pressing play.
Yes, I'm going to share audio really quick, and then we will watch this video.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Isabel and Alyssa for sharing their work with us. We're going to dive into some discussion questions now that we've formulated before the panel, and we are running a little bit behind, so we might go over, but this is being recorded. We will get to the questions in the chat, and it'll be available on our YouTube as soon as I can get it up there. So I promise that I will send that out when it is available. So let's get started, and I'm going to shoot this one to Isabel first. When we first started talking about this panel, we had a discussion about the difference between uppercase and lowercase h historic preservation. Could you just discuss the differences between those two things and what they do?
Yes, so I think this might mean different things to different people, but for me, I think of uppercase historic preservation as the beginnings of the preservation movement, these, large at-risk buildings that people rally behind to preserve. I think of large historic homes like Kikett and Biltmore. And in all of these cases, the buildings are often looked at through a lens of either who lived there, were they of note, or which architect designed them, or how important the architecture is of the structure. And it's always sort of a prioritization of architecture and design over use or habitant. And so for me, little h preservation is more about who is using the building and prioritizing use and prioritizing functionality so that a property is looked at through kind of a larger community lens. And that's everything from, reinvesting in neighborhoods that have been systematically devalued. Reinvesting in those communities and restoring properties in them is giving a function to a community more than restoring just for the sake of the design of a building. And so when I was thinking about this, I realized we're kind of talking about function over form, which in the architecture world, we all know, form over function was a real kind of topic of debate in the mid-century architecture world. And I am a mid-century lover. So I'm a big believer in function over form. And that's a little bit contradictory in some ways, I know. So it is about restoring properties that have, I think, real value, that's not tied to necessarily the architect or the architecture.
Thank you. And I'm going to pose the same question, but with lowercase and uppercase A affordable housing to Alyssa.
Yeah, so I love to use this analogy when it comes to preservation and affordable housing, because that, uppercase, lowercase is something that we do talk about when it comes to preservation. I think, though, backtracking a little bit, I think the way that I view uppercase preservation is, like Isabel said, those large buildings, they come with designation, basically, there's documentable histories and things like that. But I think lowercase preservation for me is more those vernacular housing types, right? And those buildings often lack, the integrity to be able to qualify for designation, but that also kind of stops them from being able to use preservation incentives, which are really, as Isabel also mentioned, are really important. It's that kind of but-for, that gap funding that's necessary to get projects done. So, I think, but when we're talking about those small scale, single family or multifamily buildings, we're mainly talking about unsubsidized affordable housing. And this is the affordable housing with a lowercase a. And that relies, mainly on the owner's ability to rehab and maintain their buildings in an economical manner. But, the caveat to that is that the supply of it is also dependent on a lot of different variables, like public policies, building codes, parking requirements, development fees, all that kind of stuff. And so those variables kind of have everything to do with whether or not the private market provides affordable housing in that lowercase sense. But then when I think of affordable housing with an uppercase A, I mainly think about, housing that's provided by the public sector, subsidizing it. And this type of affordable housing is usually achieved, through some kind of low income housing tax credit on the front end or housing choice vouchers on the back end. But when used with preservation, this affordable housing really does rely on that sophisticated layering of finances. And that usually always requires, historic tax credits. So I think when we typically think of the intersection of affordable housing and preservation, we're thinking about uppercase affordable housing and uppercase preservation. But we're really kind of then missing a whole lot of small scale vernacular buildings from the picture, and they're kind of falling through the cracks because we don't have tools to address a lot of those types of buildings. And that makes up a very large share of the housing stock in most of our cities. So, yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can historic preservation combat the stigma that surrounds affordable housing? I'm going to shoot that to Isabel first, and then I'll have Alyssa chime in.
Well, I'm biased that, our organization can help do that, because I do think a lot of the stigma, I'm sure many of us on this panel know about NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard. People that might be pro or in favor of the concept of affordable housing in their neighborhood or their community, but not really excited about it being right next to them or right down the road from them, and a perceived threat to their property values coming from affordable housing. So NIMBYism is a real, a very common reaction to affordable housing, and I think the stigma is largely focused on property values declining, and worry about concentrations of poverty, and worrying about just mismanagement as well. If you see, like in Roanoke, like I said, a lot of properties owned by slumlords are kind of an image that people associate with affordable housing. But for us, what we're trying to do, and I hope what we're doing in reducing the stigma through these small scale projects that subtly integrate into the existing neighborhood. So you'll be driving down a block. Like I said, this last project we did is on a block with a lot of single family homes. It's all single family homes. Some of them are renters, some of them are homeowners, and you wouldn't necessarily know the difference. And you wouldn't necessarily know that one of them might be actually, I'm sorry, I said single family homes, but I meant standalone homes. A couple of them are duplexes. So you wouldn't really know just driving through the street quickly what the density is, but you see that it's an older neighborhood with a general kind of small scale housing. And there are all these different typologies in the street of renters, duplexes, and homeowners. And we're integrating affordable housing into that street in a way that doesn't have the affordable rental units stand out as something different. And when Alyssa talked about LIHTC projects, low income housing tax credit projects are probably the predominant way that affordable housing developers create affordable housing throughout the country. And it's a competitive process. And for these developers to be awarded the tax credits, and these credits account for a large, substantial portion of their construction costs. So they're a great incentive. But in order to be competitive for them, they have to be pretty dense projects, and they're often new construction. And that's the affordable housing with the capital A, because it's what we see throughout most of the country. And it's because they also can make actual money. And so that's why it's really key as a nonprofit. We're not really looking to make a large amount of money. We're just looking to cover our basic overhead. And so we do one project a year. These projects are not dense at all. The most dense we have is the 4-unit property that I showed you all. That's the yellow house. So they're subtly integrated in a way that I think really helps people see, with the right owner that cares about investing in the property, you see an increase in property values with a preservation of affordability. And you see something that's well managed that helps show that mismanagement is not a side effect of affordability. And that's what we're trying to do. I believe, it's hard to do in many cases because, like I said, the LIHTC is the dominant way that affordable housing is built right now. I think that's, I think that's all I had. Sorry. Yeah.
Alyssa, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that Isabel, your last point about, the deterioration of properties, it's not, a lot of times it's not on the tenants, it's not on, and I think to myself about, I think the start of the stigma around uppercase affordable housing was when things were left to deteriorate, for a number of reasons. I'm thinking Cabrini Green and Pruitt-Igoe and all of those things that really kind of gave a bad name and gave affordable housing a bad rap, basically. But I think if we look at that and we say, but everybody deserves to live in quality housing, which I think is something that Isabel's organization is doing really, really well. But it's kind of changing that messaging around, what is affordable housing and who does it serve, and thinking about affordable housing more as a spectrum. And there's supportive services housing. The first example that Isabel gave would be a great example of that. There's affordable housing, there's workforce housing, there's, market rate housing, and those all have different corresponding area median income limit, set on them. And so I think, if we realize that it's not just the poorest of the poor who are affected by an affordable housing crisis, it's nurses and it's teachers and firefighters and janitors, like it's everybody. I think personalizing it and kind of acknowledging those things that have helped shape that stigma around it, I think is something that preservation can do, because we're good at interpreting things. We're good at, talking through complicated histories and things like that. So I think that's a great way that us preservationists can kind of help break down that stigma.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Alyssa, too, I think what we do is largely working in that spectrum as well. We don't target just one specific AMI for all of our projects. We look at each neighborhood individually and each project where it's based. One project, our first project, was in a neighborhood that we looked at the market around it, and it was largely 80% AMI rents, so we matched that. The next project was in a different part of town, and we offered that at 60% AMI rents. And then, like I said, the project that had the dead end street and the rescue mission, we did 30 to 50% AMI. So we look at the market around where we are and react to that and what we think both the neighborhood needs are and what the market reflects, and then decide what the affordability should be based off of that. So we're not just dropping something affordable into a neighborhood without really thinking about the context of it. And I think that's important, and where you get these really dense projects that are concentrating a large portion of 60% or 50% AMI in 40 units, it has a much more kind of disruptive effect to what like an existing neighborhood might already have in those demographics.
Absolutely. So such a robust discussion. I'm learning so much. Our next question is something that's been asked and addressed a little bit in the chat, which is what kinds of legislation or infrastructure should municipalities pursue to support historically preserved affordable housing? This could be grants, laws, land banks, which I learned about from Isabel. So I'll have Isabel go first, and then Alyssa.
Well, I learned a lot about land banks from Alyssa too, so I'll get her to talk about that. But I would definitely say land banks are a critical tool. Roanoke's in the process of trying to establish our first land bank. A lot of the properties that we're interested in they're foreclosed if they're vacant. In many cases, they go up for tax auction, and slumlords purchase them at a higher price for acquisition than maybe they're worth, because they can afford to put more into the acquisition because they put very little into the property after the acquisition. And our organization basically does the exact opposite, and we have less money to put into the acquisition because we're going to be putting so much into the construction. And so a land bank basically gives nonprofits first right of refusal to these properties before they go to auction, so that we can pay closer to what they might be valued, or very little, maybe even less than that. It sort of just depends on the structure, I think. And Alyssa could probably explain that better, but because Roanoke hasn't fully finished ours yet, we haven't had a chance to do it or use it, but I know it's in the process, and it would be really helpful for us because there's a property we have our eyes set on that is owned by the city currently, and I can't just go to them and say, sell me this property. We have to wait for it to go to tax auction, and then we're going up against people that have more money to invest in the acquisition. So that absolutely is key. Going back to, I think, how ARBs can be a little bit tricky to deal with in terms of compliance for work that you may want to do on a home in a historic district and the affordability of that work. I would say a great tool that I would love to see more of are grants for facade improvements through cities that could, or states that could really allow for that compliance. I've seen facade grants come through our city in these districts, but they're not consistently available. They're only available in the target areas that our city is working on at any given moment. They kind of zero in on a specific neighborhood for 5 years that they want to put their revitalization dollars into. And there's many other neighborhoods that are older, first-rung suburbs that need that same level of revitalization, and they're under ARB compliance, and the work that's needed to comply is cost prohibitive. So facade grants in those areas would be really critical, I think, to seeing more reinvestment. And reinvestment for me is just a synonym for preservation, I think. And finally, if I could make one plea to anybody who is working with a SHPO out there watching, if I could make any change to any kind of rule or regulation, it would be to change the window compliance for windows that go in historic structures that once had divided lights have to have replacement divided lights, which is impossible to do with a window that is being completely replaced. Because truly divided light, new windows are insulated with double panes and are very unattractive. They have a really thick muntin, and they don't match the profile of the muntins of the historic windows. And to me, if we're caring about historic, aesthetics, the spacers that are between the muntins, to me, give a better aesthetic from a distance than the ones that have the truly divided light. And I'm getting really technical right now, but for those of you in the preservation world, if you are familiar with this, I would just like to advocate. I think the spacers are not a terrible thing to use, and I actually really like them. I'm just never allowed to use them. We have to have truly divided light. And that's been a big issue with contractors that don't know how to build new windows with divided panels, and we have to seek original windows through old salvaging yards. It's very difficult work. So that's been a big headache for me, but that's super technical. And yeah, I'll let Alyssa speak more on the land bank.
Yeah, I mean, I think I literally have an Excel file on my desktop that is just called cool programs for things like this, where I'm like, I just kind of like hoard them and I collect them. But yeah, I think there are a lot of programs out there for uppercase affordable housing and uppercase preservation, right? And there's plenty of stuff out there for that. But I think getting to those tools and legislation for, things that are more vernacular, that are not historic districts, is really important. And I think that's where we really get into land banking and land trusts. Land banks are really great in communities that have a lot of quote unquote blighted properties. And it really does. It takes that delinquent property that is, it kind of cuts all the strings that are tied to it and makes it available for, developers or nonprofits or, anything like that. It helps with that transition to productive use. And then land trusts are really great models too, that especially in areas where property values are rapidly rising, it separates the land value from the improvement value, and a nonprofit holds the property or like the land value, and then the owner holds the improvement value. So that's a really good tool in areas that are really experiencing a lot of change. But I also think about like receivership programs and buy and hold programs for affordable housing. Cleveland and Buffalo, I know they both have these kind of receivership programs that are really great. And it would be really interesting to see a lot of those turned into, using it towards affordable housing. And then of course we've got like revolving funds that are great. Pittsburgh has one that's used on non-designated historic or older buildings. Historic Boston does some, Isabel's organization does them. So it's using kind of all these different tools. Like I want us to expand past designation as a stipulation to use them. I think we'd be able to get at a lot more of the housing stock that's in our communities, looking at it that way.
Thank you both. We are running low on time. If you are available to stick around, we're going to continue the conversation and try to get through 2 more questions that we established ahead of time. We're going to go through those as quickly as we can, Isabel and Alyssa, and then we're going to dive into the great questions that you guys have been asking in the chat. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and I'm excited to dive in. So as quickly as you can, I'm going to shoot this one to Alyssa. What is the economic impact of using historic structures for affordable housing?
Yeah, so I think, if we're talking about adaptive reuse, or, using a once abandoned building, like that's, there's so many benefits, and they're kind of obvious. There's like getting that property back on the tax rolls. I don't think any, local city official would be opposed to having that happen. But it's also increasing, the purchasing power of the community. If you put housing where it wasn't before, those people who live there are going to now go to the local grocery store. They're going to go to the local restaurants. They're going to go, they're going to spend and circulate their money in that local economy. And then obviously there's jobs that are created from construction activity, and those jobs, they come with income, and that income has direct and indirect and all these different kind of impacts and ripple effects in their community. So I mean, there's so many different ways that, putting housing in areas really helps the local community.
Amazing. Thank you. And then our last question before we jump into the discussion with our chat questions is, how can residents, both homeowners and renters, get involved in this issue?
I would probably suggest the opposite of the NIMBYism movement, which is a growing movement. Many of you probably heard of the YIMBYism for the urban planners in the crowd, which I have an urban planning background, which is yes, in my backyard. And really just, I think being open and receptive to, a slightly more flexible way of looking at housing. So that's everything from, neighborhood groups, and I think being an advocate, as if you're a member of a neighborhood group, to preservation groups, and being an advocate for flexible zoning, especially, that can help create this sort of missing middle housing, which is a real part of what we're talking about. Really, these smaller vernacular homes that are in blighted neighborhoods, that are also historic neighborhoods and historic homes, offer this great kind of missing middle if they have the right zoning connected to them that allows for flexible use. And so I think really having people that are not afraid of that speak up in defense of it and be advocates. So, not being fearful of the form of hearing about renters or affordable housing. It's really about who the owner is, and is the owner somebody that is both interested in reinvesting and being a good steward of the property. And at the end of the day, that matters so much more than whether or not it's rental or affordable. And when we first started doing what we did, our first project, everybody in the neighborhood was against it because they didn't want more rental and they didn't want affordable rental. And since then, we've tried really hard to prove that those two things do not make a difference in the outcome. In fact, it makes a great positive difference for the tenants that live there. But for the neighborhood, we've invested heavily and gotten rid of a vacant property that had been vacant for 10 years. So in fact, at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with I think what people were fearful of.
Alyssa, anything to add?
No, I do. Well, yeah, I guess. I think that point about making sure that the owners are, it's really on the owners in this situation. And I think, there are a lot of tools for property owners, but I think ensuring that those tools kind of have benefits for those renters in the end is really important. And ensuring that, a landlord is getting a grant and actually making improvements, but not raising the rent. That grant is supposed to be there so that they can make those improvements and not push people out after the improvement is done. So I think, kind of thinking about it like that, renters, we always think of home ownership as like something that really creates solid communities and stuff like that. But I'm a renter. A lot of the people I know are renters. We all really care about our community too. And I think kind of finding things that help have a pass through to us can only strengthen communities more.
Wonderful. Okay, let's dive into these questions from our audience. The first one I think is really spectacular. It's from Beth. And it says, how do we engage with issues of the neighborhood or the property itself being historically unwelcoming or even traumatic to folks in many of the demographic areas we would hope to serve with affordable housing?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's very complicated. I don't have great answers for that. I think we did have the property that is the nonprofit co-working space was not a plantation, even though it looks kind of like one. It actually a lot of the neoclassical details that look like a plantation home came in the 1920s. It was originally a federal style home. But it was built in a time when neither African Americans nor women could own property. And it is interesting to me now that that it is owned by an organization of women and inhabited by largely African American serving African American owned nonprofits serving an African American community. And those nonprofits actually also want to purchase the property from us in several years once the property is out of tax credit compliance, and we are hoping that they will. So it is a property that doesn't necessarily have trauma related to it, but I think it's really interesting how it kind of symbolizes and reflects a period of history that was so or I guess so exclusive to the group and the neighborhood that it serves now, and it's completely flipped the narrative and is now community center. But that's its own story, and each property with different, I guess, histories and events connected to those histories is going to be different and dealt with differently. I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's really complicated and probably too complicated for me to speak to as somebody. I'm not of color and I can't really speak to that probably in my own experience. It's not right for me to speak, I think, to that. But I'd be interested if anybody else has experience with that here today that could speak to that.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I do think that one thing we can do is not, form these relationships with communities, not when it's just convenient for us and when we need to go there and actually want to do work, right? Like we need to be forging those relationships early on, making sure that they're part of the conversation and at the table when we're talking about the planning, when we're talking about the development of those properties, and not just kind of swooping in and doing the work and then leaving, but really making sure that you're part of that community. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, those are great points. I think in kind of a similar vein, we have a question about partnerships and how you identify the partners that you bring on and the organizations that you want to work with. And I think that feeds really well into this. Picking who you want to partner with and what they do for your community can really drastically change the way that you can address those potential traumas. So Isabel, could you speak a little bit about kind of how you find those partner organizations that you work with?
Yeah, I think again, it's kind of like the rents. We look neighborhood specific. We're looking at the project comes to us first. The house comes to us first, whether it's gifted to us or we decide to buy it, and then we kind of look afterward at how can we best serve the neighborhood, and what does that look like from the rents and the affordability, and what does that look like from the needs of the neighborhood kind of more broadly. And so our last project, we partnered with a resettlement nonprofit, Commonwealth Catholic Charities, because they were looking for housing for Afghan refugees. They came to us. But it was really, I think, a great solution for us in wanting to, find a family that was even large enough for this house, because it's a 3-bedroom house as well. Before that, the project that's permanent supportive housing, we looked, we knew that we needed a housing partner that could provide rental subsidy and supportive services. And there's only one organization in Roanoke that does that, and that's Arch Services. And they receive those vouchers through the city of Roanoke. So different cities have different conduits for their PSH vouchers, but throughout Virginia, PSH vouchers are available to most entitlement cities. And so we knew we needed to partner with them in order to make a PSH project work. And for Villa Heights with the nonprofits, again, it came down to what are the community's needs. We searched around looking for tenants. Our first tenant that we were going to partner with fell through, and I won't go into that story, but we really wanted to find somebody that loved the neighborhood and was committed to it and understood, I think, both how to be a service to the neighborhood, but also how to bridge what would feel like a little bit of a there's a newness to this restoration. This house had been vacant for 10 years and it was a big dramatic change, and really helping to kind of make it feel like a neighborhood resource. And it's an after school space and it has parkland and all the kids in the neighborhood use it. They don't have to be connected with the nonprofits there. But the nonprofits that we work with there are the reason that that works, because that's such a big part of their mission, is for it to be a community resource. So we had a competitive process of 2 different nonprofit applicants to be the anchor tenant, and the group that's there now was chosen because we thought they would be the best as a community resource. So each project is different. Each project we look at through this lens of what the neighborhood needs and how we can make the project functional, and which nonprofit might help us fulfill that function best.
Thank you. We're not going to get to all these questions. There's so many amazing ones. So if we don't get to your question, I'm going to send them to Alyssa and Isabel, and I can send those answers out to everybody who attended today, along with any links that were, anything we talked about and our chat. But the next one that I want you guys to address, and I'm going to give this one to Alyssa. Could you talk a little bit about how affordable housing can align with flexible or tailored historic districts? And are there any examples that you could point to for this model?
Yeah. Flexible or tailored historic districts. I'm thinking like neighborhood conservation districts, maybe that's a way. Some people term those as like preservation light, but there's also multiple property listings. Like here in Chicago, we have a couple of those. We have one for bungalows, and it kind of legitimizes the bungalow as a form of kind of workforce housing from the mid 19th century and stuff. So I think those kinds of districts make it, they do open up some carrots, I guess you could say. But yeah, I think that looking at different types of districting, a little bit more tiered districting would help a little bit with that, to, at least establish certain typologies as something that is, worthy of protection and stuff like that, but still able to maybe get incentives, so yeah, I'm trying to think of different types of districts. I know there has been a lot of work with neighborhood conservation districts. We've got them, I think, in Nashville, and I'm blanking on other places where we have them, but there can definitely be like affordable housing overlay zones or things like that can correspond with these really intact housing, units. So.
Wonderful, thank you. The last question that I would like for you guys to address is a really interesting topic. It's from somebody who lives in one of the wealthy white areas of DC. And it says that they're seriously lacking in their contribution to the city's need for more affordable housing. And then she says, it seems like historic preservation locks in place large lot sizes where we need greater density if we're going to make a real contribution. And her question is it possible that historic preservation is a less helpful tool for that purpose in achieving, a greater level of affordable housing? Like, are there times when maybe we shouldn't be using historic preservation to achieve this end?
I would be interested in, I don't know if we can get an elaboration of that. What does that mean exactly? How is preservation locking it in?
Yeah.
I think my guess is that it's referring to, because the lots are so large and the houses are only so big, how many people can you actually comfortably house in there without adding additional properties onto the lot.
Right.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think my initial thought was, if these are really large lot sizes, there is ADUs, I mean, you can be adding ADUs. I think, my one bone to pick with ADUs and things like that is that I want them to serve the community. I want them to provide affordable housing or more housing in a neighborhood without being used for Airbnbs or short-term rentals, because then that takes away that property from the housing market, But yeah, my initial thought went straight to, that sounds like it's a prime opportunity for ADUs and, secondary units to be put in place. But yeah.
Right. I'm looking at a lot of the chats and people talking about how YIMBYs are very anti-preservation. And I think what I'm sort of better able to articulate now and seeing that is that I think what would be so critical and helpful is for more preservationists to be more of a YIMBY, to think more like the planners that want this very minimal slight density, and ADUs are such a great example of that, because I think just having more people interested in preservation that see the benefit of light density or slightly larger density, but still light, I think could really help these two worlds kind of work together more cohesively. And ADUs, I think the Airbnb that you mentioned is such an interesting thing, because they've really forced local governments, I feel like, to have more flexible zoning for ADUs because of allowance of Airbnbs, which has helped open up this discussion, and it's helpful. But on the flip side, all of these units are being used for Airbnbs and not for housing. So it's both, starting the discussion, but not solving the problem necessarily.
Thank you both. What I'm hearing is that historic preservation is always the solution, and we just have to spread the word more effectively, which is why we're all here today having this wonderful conversation. Thank you both, Alyssa and Isabel. This was a wonderful, robust conversation. I know everyone here really enjoyed it and learned a lot, as did I. And thank you to everybody in attendance. This was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate all of your engagement. We will be sending out, we have a survey in the chat. I'll also send that link later, and I will send you all the information that I can gather from Alyssa and Isabel so that we can continue thinking about this and learning about this and having additional conversations. All I'm seeing here is more programs that we can have, more topics that we can talk about, which is music to my ears.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you again soon. Thanks for joining us. Have a lovely day.
Great. Thank you.